The morning Daniel Walsh buried the only woman he had ever loved. It rained so hard the flowers on her casket turned to mush before the priest finished speaking. He stood there in a black suit that felt like armor made of paper, holding an umbrella over a 6-year-old girl who kept asking him where Mommy went. He didn't have an answer. He was 34 years old, a man who had built his entire life around one person. And now that person was gone, and in her place stood a small child with her mother's brown eyes and a yellow raincoat covered in cartoon ducks, looking up at him like he was the only solid thing left in the world. Her name was Lily, and Daniel had no idea what to do with her. He and Claire had been together for 4 years. Not married, they had talked about it, argued about it gently the way people do when they love each other but disagree on timing. But they had been building a life together. A shared apartment in Columbus, Ohio, a kitchen where she made coffee too strong and he never complained, a routine that felt like coming home every single day. Lily was Claire's daughter from a relationship that ended before Daniel ever arrived. And from the very first weekend he met her, a rainy Saturday when she handed him a crayon drawing of a horse and told him it was him, he had loved her without question or condition. But loving a child on weekends is one thing. Becoming her entire world is something else. Claire's parents were gone. Her father had died 3 years earlier. Her mother lost to dementia in a facility in Michigan, who no longer recognized her own name. The man who fathered Lily had signed away his rights when she was 2 and had not looked back since. There was no one. There was only Daniel, a man with no legal standing, no official title, no paperwork that said he belonged to this child in any way the world would recognize. He hired a lawyer the week after the funeral, not because he had a plan, but because when he dropped Lily off at school that first Monday, and she turned back at the gate and said, "You're coming back, right?" Something in his chest cracked clean open, and he knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to the bone, that he was not going anywhere. The lawyer told him it would take time. There would be home studies and background checks and court appointments. The state of Ohio would need to be satisfied that he was a fit guardian, then eventually, if he chose, a fit adoptive parent. It was not a simple process for a man who was not a blood relative, who had never been married to the child's mother, who existed in the eyes of the law as essentially a stranger. Daniel didn't care. He filled out every form. He answered every question. He sat across from a social worker named Mrs. Greer, who had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much, and asked him, very directly, why he wanted to do this. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "Because she already calls me Dad, and because I don't know how to be the kind of man who walks away." Mrs. Greer wrote something down and didn't smile, but her pen moved softly, and somehow he felt like he had said the right thing. The first year was the hardest thing Daniel had ever survived, and he had survived things. He had lost his own father at 17. He had rebuilt himself from that. But grief at 17 is a wound you carry into adulthood. Grief at 34, while raising a 6-year-old who woke up crying for her mother 3 nights out of 7, is something that has no bottom. You just keep falling and keep functioning at the same time. And you learn, very slowly, that those two things can coexist. Lily had nightmares. She went through a phase where she refused to eat anything except peanut butter and apple slices. She had a teacher who called him every other week to report that. Lily had cried again at circle time. And every time Daniel hung up the phone, he sat in his car in the parking lot of whatever job site he was on. He was a project manager for a mid-sized construction company, and let himself have 5 minutes before going back inside. 5 minutes was all he allowed. Then he got back to work. Then he went home and made dinner. Then he sat with Lily at the kitchen table and helped her with spelling words and told her about his day and asked about hers. And he listened, really listened, the way Claire had always listened to him. Like what she was saying mattered more than anything else happening in the room. He didn't date. He didn't think about it. There were people in his life, his friend Marcus, his coworker Joanne, who gently suggested, after 8 months, after a year, that he should think about himself too. He appreciated their concern and ignored it completely, not because he was punishing himself, but because he genuinely did not have the energy or the desire. Everything he had went into keeping this small person steady, and slowly it worked. Lily started sleeping through the night. She stopped crying at circle time. She made a best friend named Priya, who wore her hair in 2 pom-pom pigtails and came over after school on Tuesdays. She started soccer, was terrible at it, loved it anyway. She grew 2 inches in 8, Months and outgrew every pair of shoes he bought before he could blink. One evening, when she was 7, she was doing homework at the kitchen table while he cooked pasta, and she looked up and said, completely out of nowhere, "Daniel, how come your last name is Walsh and mine is Parker?" He turned from the stove. He had been waiting for this question. He had even practiced an answer, and yet now that it was here, his throat tightened and he had to take a breath before he could speak. "Because I wasn't officially your dad yet when you were born," he said carefully. "But I'm working on changing that, if you want me to." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "I want to be Lily Walsh." He turned back to the stove so she wouldn't see his face. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday in April, 16 months after Claire died. The judge was a heavyset man named Honorable Gerald Price, who had a reputation for being no-nonsense and who looked, when Daniel first saw him, like a man who had not smiled in a courtroom in 20 years. But when Lily walked in a yellow dress she had picked herself, holding a drawing she had made the night before that she wanted to give the judge, Gerald Price looked at her over his glasses and something in his face shifted, just slightly, the way stone shifts when something warmer moves underneath it. He asked her a few questions. Simple ones. Did she know why she was there? Did she want this? Did she understand what it meant? Lily answered each one with the solemn seriousness of a child who has learned early that some things are important. Then she handed him the drawing. It was a picture of 2 figures, a tall one and a small one, standing in front of a house, with a yellow sun in the corner and the words, in large imperfect letters, "My dad and me." Judge Price looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he signed the papers. And just like that, on a Tuesday in April with rain on the courthouse windows, Lily Claire Walsh existed in the eyes of the law. Before you keep reading, if this story is reaching something inside you, stay with it. What's coming next is the part that will stay with you. Watch until the very end, and if this channel has ever given you something real, this is the moment to subscribe and leave us with a like. We make these stories for people who feel things deeply. This one is for you. Daniel had thought the adoption would be an ending, a door closing on the worst chapter of his life, the grief and the uncertainty and the fear, but it wasn't an ending. It was more like a foundation, something solid, finally existing under his feet, and once it was there, he started, almost without realizing it, to live again. He went back to the gym. He started reading novels, something he hadn't done since college. He joined Marcus for dinner one Friday and laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time in what felt like years. He noticed, around month 18 after Claire's death, that mornings no longer felt like something to get through. They felt occasionally like something to look forward to. Lily turned 8, then 9. She got better at soccer, not because she was naturally gifted, but because she was relentlessly stubborn, a quality she had inherited, Daniel suspected, from Claire. She won a reading contest at school and stood up in front of the whole auditorium and gave a little speech thanking her teacher, her friend Priya, and my dad, who reads with me every night even though he always falls asleep before me. The auditorium laughed. Daniel turned red and was not remotely ashamed. He started to think sometimes that he was okay, that this life, smaller and stranger and harder than the one he had imagined, but real, wholly real, was enough, more than enough. It was his. The letter came on a Wednesday when Lily was 10. It was from a law office in Denver. Inside was a document he had to read 3 times before it registered. A man named Stephen Holloway, who had died 6 weeks earlier with no surviving relatives, had left a portion of his estate, a meaningful portion, to one Lily Claire Parker, whom he had fathered and whom he had spent 8 years regretting abandoning. There was a personal letter attached, handwritten, shaky at the edges, like it had been written by someone who was very ill and very afraid. In it, Stephen Holloway said he knew he had no right to reach out. He said he had followed from a distance what he could find, a school photo posted on a community board, a name in a local news item about a soccer tournament, and that he had been a coward his whole life and was trying, too late, to do one thing right. He had not known until he hired someone to look that Claire was gone. He had not known that Lily had been adopted. He wrote that when he found out, he cried for the first time in 30 years, and that the reason he cried was not guilt exactly, but something closer to gratitude, that she had someone, that this man, this Daniel Walsh, had shown up and stayed. He left her the money with one request, that she be told someday that her biological father was sorry, and that he hoped she had a good life, and that he never stopped thinking about her, even when he was too weak to act on it. Daniel sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading the letter. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. That night after dinner, he told Lily about the letter. He told her all of it, slowly, carefully, watching her face. She listened without interrupting. She was 10 now, old enough to hold complex things, young enough that they still left marks. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Was he a bad person?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I think he was a scared person," he said, "who made bad choices, and then, at the end, tried to make one good one." She nodded slowly. "Are you sad?" He looked at her. This child with her mother's eyes and a yellow soccer cleat she had kicked under the table and forgotten about. This person who had become the organizing principle of his entire existence. And he said, "Honestly, no, I think I feel something like grateful. Because whatever he was or wasn't, he stepped away. And that meant you needed someone to step up. And that person got to be me." Lily looked at him for a long time with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she slid off her chair, crossed the kitchen, and hugged him around the middle with both arms, the way she had when she was 6, in a yellow raincoat at a rainy graveside, except now she was taller and stronger, and she held on like she meant it. "I'm glad it was you too," she said into his shirt. Daniel Walsh, 36 years old, a man who had buried the love of his life and raised her daughter alone and signed papers in a courthouse and fallen asleep, reading chapter books and driven to soccer tournaments and cried in parking lots and gotten back up every single time, held on and did not let go. Outside, the evening was settling in over Columbus, Ohio. The streetlights came on one by one down the block. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and a neighbor's car pulled into a driveway. The world was ordinary and unhurried and exactly as it should be. Inside the kitchen, a father and his daughter stood holding each other in the quiet, and neither one of them needed to say anything else. He had given her his last name. She had given him back his life, and in the end, that was the only story that mattered. That's it. That's the whole story. If it stayed with you, if it made you feel something, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Subscribe, leave a like, and come back for the next one. These stories don't end. They just keep going.